Okay, so we're going to be talking obviously about 5 ways to reduce feeding costs tonight. And the biggest tip, the number one tip, and also the tip that is going to take the most expense out of your feeding program is to make best use of your least expensive nutrients. So I asked quickly last night, what's your best guess at what your least expensive source of nutrients are? I'll see if someone can get the answer up there real quick. What is it? What component of your horse's diet do you think would provide the least expensive source of nutrients? And predominantly I'm meaning protein and energy. Yep, pasture. Yep, you've got it. So pasture is definitely your least expensive source of nutrients, and it doesn't matter what your pasture looks like. So in the top left of those pasture photos there, that's a ryegrass pasture that was doing famously well over winter here. Top right is a pretty much in Badlands of Wyoming pasture, a photo I took last year. So and then the bottom right is a North Queensland photo, and the bottom left is North Queensland, bottom right is one of our paddocks after it had been mown or slashed not that long ago. So it doesn't matter what your pasture looks like. Obviously there's massive variation, and these 4 photos, I mean, they capture some of the variation, but certainly not all the variation. So it doesn't matter what your pasture looks like, it is still going to be your least expensive source of nutrients. So Cliss has actually made a comment there, my mortgage costs a fortune, my pasture is not cheap. So you're right, Cliss, like the land that we grow pasture on is not cheap. But I guess how I'm looking at this is you're going to have that land regardless. So your horses need land generally to live on. So you're going to have that cost of your land. Now, how much pasture you grow on that land, though, is completely in your control. So you can actually do, this is what we're going to talk about, you can do quite a few things to get that land that is costing you a fortune to provide more of this least expensive source of nutrients. So I'm not taking into account the cost of land, because my assumption is you're going to have that land anyway. But whether you have that land as really overgrazed, poorly managed, no pasture land, or if you have it as really well managed, very productive pasture land, then that's going to make a big difference to your feeding costs. I hope that makes sense, the way that I'm looking at it. So like I said, pasture is by far your least expensive source of nutrients. And if you look in dairy literature, they estimate that pasture can cost as little as 5 cents per kilogram of dry matter. Now, that is not taking into account the capital value of the land that it's growing on. That's taking into account all the other inputs that might go into pasture, so your seed and your fertilizer, any time that is spent maintaining pasture, picking up manure and things like that. So it really is very cheap. And if you look at it just for comparison, a brown bale of hay is going to cost around 28 cents per kilogram. So if you're used to speaking in pounds, and sorry, I haven't converted a lot of these amounts to pounds from me, but roughly halve it for a pound. Like a pound is 0.45, I think, of a kilo. So just very roughly halve those amounts in your head, and you'll have about 2.5 cents per kilogram of dry matter. Sorry, per pound of dry matter for pasture, and around 14 cents per pound of dry matter for a round bale. So it is a lot cheaper, even than hay, which is one of the less expensive, I guess, components per kilogram of your horse's feeding program. So maximising your pasture intake when it's available is your single most effective means of reducing your feeding costs. So if you can maximise the amount of pasture your horse is eating, that's going to have the biggest effect on reducing your feeding costs. Now, to do that, you can either maximize the amount of, or you have to really do both. You must maximize the amount of pasture you have available. So you maximize the amount of pasture that's actually growing on your land, and also maximize the amount of pasture your horse will eat. So I'm just going to talk about that second point just briefly. It's not uncommon to see, and particularly on breeding farms, it's not uncommon to see horses that are being fed so much hard feed that they're too full to really want to go out and graze pasture, and they will literally just lie around on grass like it's a nice soft thing to sleep on, and wait around until the next meal arrives, and they'll nibble at it when they're bored or when they're a little bit hungry, but they won't actually go out and really actively graze that. So you do need to keep in mind that, and this is particularly applicable for anyone who's got a hard keeper and you are feeding large amounts of feed in an attempt to put weight on them. You really need to be conscious of the fact that for every kilogram or pound of feed that you're feeding that horse, you're going to be reducing their pasture dry matter intake by about that same amount. So if you do have pasture available, it's this balancing act of finding at what point is it not going to be enough hard feed to maintain their weight, and how much, I guess, can you bring the hard feed down and have your horse actually go out and utilize the pasture more and still maintain or gain weight the way that you need. So if you are feeding large amounts of feed and you do have average to good or excellent quality pasture available, do just be aware that every time you feed your horse something as a hard feed or grain, we call it all sorts of things in all over different parts of the world, but anything that you're putting in a bucket or a feed bin and feeding to your horse, you are going to reduce that horse's desire to go out and eat pasture. So just keep that in the back of your mind. The biggest key to maximising pasture intake, though, is, of course, making sure that you've got pasture available on in your pastures, in your paddocks, whatever you might call them. So to maximise your available pasture, there's a number of things to do. So top of the list there, and this is particularly applicable if you're on a reasonably small acreage and you can't effectively rotational graze or have horses off areas of pasture for long periods of time, is to manage the manure. So horses instinctively know, they're funny, like they're coprophagic, so they will eat manure, but they also instinctively know that they should avoid grazing around manure because that's where they pick up intestinal parasites. So you will all have observed that where there is a manure pile, generally the horses will avoid grazing in that area. And sometimes horses in small areas will put a manure pile and generally go and put their manure in that same spot all the time. So you get reasonably large areas of the pasture that they won't graze on much, if at all. So if you are on small acreages, it is really important to manage your manure either by picking up on a daily basis or, as often as you can, or when you can take horses off the pasture to use harrows and actually spread the manure around really, really well, so that it does mulch back into the ground and it's not going to stop them from grazing in those areas. So that's really important, particularly for small acreages. We are fortunate enough we don't have to pick up manure because we've got enough area that they're very rarely grazing on the same area more than once in a 12-month period. We've got so I don't need to do that, but then we've also got a very active population of dung beetles. So if you can somehow encourage dung beetles to come and live on your property as well, they really help because, of course, they pull the manure down into the soil and take it off the soil surface and stop this effect of the manure stopping the horses from grazing. So the second thing is to avoid overgrazing. So when you overgraze a grass, the green leaf area on a grass is like its food production system. So the green leaves will sit there and capture the sunlight during the day, and they'll take the energy from the sun, they'll take carbon dioxide from the air, and they'll take water from the soil, and they actually, through the process of photosynthesis, which we all learnt about at school, they develop carbohydrates, and then those carbohydrates are then used as the plant's food source, and the plant uses them to grow. So if you overgraze a plant, you actually take away their food production system, and it takes a long time. If the plant is overgrazed and grazed right down to almost nothing, it takes that plant a really, really long time to build up enough food production system or leaf area to allow it to get going again. It's kind of like if you thought about it like having, say, a really heavy four-wheel drive, and you had to like push it, and you had to put an awful lot of energy in to get it moving at all. But then once it's moving, it took less energy to keep it moving. It's the same for a plant. So if the plant is completely overgrazed or completely at a standstill, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort for that plant to actually get going. But then once it's got its leaf area, it can grow quite quickly. So what you want to do is maintain a good leaf area all the time, so that it's never taking a long time to come back from being overgrazed. So I did just, Callie's just saying, concern here is fertilised lush pasture affecting health. I couldn't agree more, Callie, and I see this so much, particularly on breeding farms, where they tend to over-fertilise pastures. They get high nitrate levels, they get high phosphorus levels, low calcium levels, and there's all sorts of issues with that. So just remember, I'm not necessarily talking here about lush and improved pastures. So my pasture, particularly over summer, is a very native, what you would classify say if you were thinking from a dairy or a beef sheep type system, you're classified as very poor quality pasture, but still all the same rules still apply. So you still want that pasture to be able to come back once the horses have grazed it down. And we'll talk about fertilizer in a minute, but you still want to give the plants that you have the best chance of being able to grow. So I do agree, lush, heavily fertilized pasture is generally not a great thing for horses. The other thing with overgrazing too is when you graze a plant right down, its root system will start to shrink because it doesn't have enough food to keep its whole root system alive. So then, of course, the plant can't access the nutrients it needs to grow either. And you just end up in this whole messy situation where the poor plant is so compromised that it takes forever to come back. So if you have, say a long period where your horses are overgrazing a pasture and then you do get some rain, it will take your pastures forever to actually respond to that rain. And if they can't respond quickly enough, often what happens is that the water will dry up before they get a chance to actually grow and do anything for you. So a few ways to avoid overgrazing. You can use strip grazing, which we've been talking about a lot on FeedXL. And if you go to our Facebook page, there's a video of me just showing my strip grazing system if you want to have a look and see how that works. So the best way to do it is to have a front fence that gives the horses the access to the fresh pasture each day, but then follow that with a back fence so that they can't go back and actually graze back over the areas they've already grazed, so that protects the plants and stops them from overgrazing the plants, and it also stops them from having excess pasture intake and not actually being, this is for everyone that's got an easy keeper, that back fence will stop your horses from accessing feed that you don't necessarily want them to have, that is generally just going to go toward making them fat. You can also use rotational grazing, and you can use rotational grazing even on really small areas. So, in the days of electric fences and easy to move posts, it's very easy to set up rotational grazing. And honestly, the more paddocks you can create essentially, and the longer you can give certain areas to rest and to grow back, the better. And it will mean that you should be able to manage your pasture so that you do have pasture a lot of the time, and then you've got lots of this very cheap source of nutrients. So you want to use soil testing and appropriate fertilizer. So like I said, our pastures are definitely not what I would consider lush, particularly over summer. But when we first moved to this place, there was a lot of issues with getting any pasture to grow. And when we soil tested, we found that it was low in phosphorus, but it was also critically low in sulfur. So we've just applied those two nutrients. We didn't need to apply potassium or nitrogen, which are really expensive nutrients to apply. So by using the purpose of using soil testing is to actually identify what's missing, and then you just apply appropriate fertilizer, which kind of links back to what you were saying too, Callie, in that if you are applying the wrong fertilizer, so if you say, for example, you're applying a lot of nitrogen when your soil doesn't actually need additional nitrogen, that's when you get in a situation of creating these high nitrate pastures, which can cause a lot of damage in the gut. That can also lead to laminitis in my experience. So you do have to be careful with what nutrients you're applying. And I can see Katie also saying too, you have the same concern, very easy keepers and one who has PSSM. So yeah, Katie, I have seen quite often, I'm not sure where you are, but certainly in regions where you get a lot of cool season grasses, and particularly grasses like ryegrass growing, they will be enough sugars and starches in them to actually trigger the PSSM. So you're in Wisconsin. So if you do have cool season grasses or grasses that are likely to accumulate sugars, that can definitely be an issue. With easy keepers, they need so little pasture. So you're generally in a better position when you're really wanting to maximize pasture and have a lot of pasture available. Is much more so for people who have got hard keepers or horses in a lot of work and they're needing to feed them a lot. My horses are always restricted with their pasture access, so they're always either being strip grazed or they've always got grazing muzzles on, unless they get into decent amounts of work, which happens very rarely, and then they have more access to pasture. But it is a tricky one. Recommendations for types of grasses. Katie, if I can get you, we do, and I know Sam has been writing up a document about all the different grasses that are available and what they're useful for. And I've also just written a chapter for the Veterinary Clinics of North America publication about forages, and it's all North America focused, so there's some information on there as well. But can I get you to go to our FeedXL Facebook group, so FeedXL Horse Nutrition and join the group if you're not a member already. You don't need to be a member of FeedXL to join that. So I'd love for you all to join us on that group, and you can ask questions, like more specific questions like that, and we can answer them in there for you. And then the last little tip on the pastures is to use both winter and summer active foragers. So if you're in an area, I know there's a lot of areas, particularly in North America, where it's just simply too cold for anything to grow over winter. But if you are in a more temperate climate and you can have pasture growing summer and winter, then it's a good idea to have a mixture of pasture species so that you can have very summer active ones and also very winter active ones, and then you have a lovely supply of nutrients sort of 12 months of the year, if you can manage that. Now, an agronomist is worth their weight in gold. If you can find yourself a good agronomist, they will help you with the soil testing, they will help you with the appropriate fertilizer, and they can also help you with the forages that will grow specifically in your area. So we can tell you forages that would be good for particular types of horses. Your agronomist then needs to be able to say, well, this grass will grow in this area, but this one won't, and figure out what ones are suitable for your soil type and your climate that you've got. So that covers maximising the intake of your least expensive source of nutrients. Monique just said a really interesting thing. So I train racehorses. Wouldn't too much pasture access be detrimental? Monique, I'm probably thinking, are you thinking from a gut weight perspective maybe, or too much fibre? I do want to say here, we're having a lot of success with racehorses in giving them access to so much more fibre. So racehorse feeding and trainers have really fallen into the trap of knowing that, grain is really useful for a racehorse because it gives them a supply of glucose, fills up their muscle glycogen, and allows them to do that fast work. But it's gone too far in the favour of grain. So typically now, what a racehorse diet, if I was working on a racehorse diet, would have around 1 to 4 kilograms, but absolute maximum for your average size racehorse, of grain or grain-based feeds, and then the rest would be fibre. So it's actually, I think it would actually be really beneficial for your racehorses. You may need to restrict their access to it leading into just the day before a race if you're worried about gut weight, but other than that, having pasture access for racehorses would be unbelievable. And of course too, they've got their head down grazing, which would allow them to clear their lungs very effectively, which, lung health, respiratory health in racehorses is a big thing. So don't be scared of pasture if you've got racehorses. There's a lot of people now trying to train out of paddocks too, so that the horses do have a lot of pasture. I'll move on to the next tip. So the next one is maximising digestion. And I've got a thing here just saying, if your horse is only half digesting what you are feeding, you will need to feed twice as much to meet requirements, which makes a lot of logical sense, doesn't it? So you put food into your horse's mouth and it has to travel all the way through the gastrointestinal tract, and you want it that by the time it comes out as manure at the other end of your horse, the ideal situation is that every bit of nutrition in that feed that you've been feeding, that your horse can access, has been accessed, has been digested and actually absorbed into your horse's body. But there's a lot of different things that can actually knock digestion around and reduce the digestion of all sorts of things. So proteins, calories, definitely fiber, and we'll talk about them in a minute, because if you can make sure that your horse is extracting all of the nutrition it possibly can out of what you're feeding, it means you can feed less, and then when you can feed less, it costs you less. So how to maximise digestion? The first tip here is to feed small meals. So before I talk about this, I just want to talk just a little bit about the gastrointestinal physiology of a horse. So some of you may or may not have seen, and I often like to ask, I'll ask it if you want to, feel free to answer it, is if I gave you a pencil and a piece of paper right now, could you draw your horse's gastrointestinal tract? Because it's actually really important to understand what an animal's gastrointestinal tract looks like, so that you understand how it's designed or evolved to work over many years, so that you can then feed your horse in a way that actually suits its gut and will allow it to maximize digestion. So after your horse eats its feed and it heads down the esophagus, it will end up in the stomach, which is exactly the same as us. So we're monogastrics. Our horses are also monogastrics. Our stomachs are different and they function in different ways. And the main job of a horse's gastric stomach is to hold feed and then release it slowly into the small intestine, so that the small intestine has got enough time to actually digest that feed. Now, in the small intestine, the digestion is carried out via enzymes. And just think about enzymes as being like tiny little pairs of scissors. And there's specific enzymes to cut up protein, there's specific enzymes to cut up starch, and also specific enzymes to cut up oil. So once the feed's in the small intestine, this process of cutting up begins. And the process of digestion, the easiest way to think about it is it's just cutting big stuff into little stuff. And the reason that needs to happen is if the horse's gut allowed big stuff to be absorbed, you would also see the absorption of bacteria and pathogens and toxins, all this muck that is in your horse's gut that should never ever end up in the body would actually be able to cross the gut wall as well. So the gut wall is really very smart in that it requires everything to be cut up into very small pieces to be absorbed. So if you think about that in terms of starch, starch is the white stuff. So if you bite a piece of barley or corn or maize in half and you see the white stuff in the middle, that's the starch that's in the grain. It's the primary reason we feed grains, because it's a really good source of energy, particularly for high performance horses. But all starch is just these pieces of glucose all joined together. And it can be in a long chain like this, or it can be a little bit branched, but essentially it's just glucose molecules stuck together. Now, for that to be digested and then absorbed, it just needs to be cut into single glucose pieces. And then once it's cut into single glucose pieces, it's actually the glucose that gets absorbed into the body. So if you think about feeding in small meals, the reason we say feed in small meals is because a horse's stomach is not very big. And so once you fill that stomach, if your horse is still eating feed, it means that the stomach can't hold more feed than it can fit in it. And so the feed coming down the esophagus is also going to push feed out into the small intestine. And if you're feeding very big meals, it just means that the speed with which feed is traveling through the small intestine is going to increase. So I just want to show you literally the process of digestion. So I'm not going to cut up my white fluffy balls because they take too long to make, but I've got a bit of ribbon here that's got knots tied into it. And if we imagine that each knot is a piece of glucose and that I have a pair of starch digesting enzyme scissors here, the process of digestion is literally just this cutting up of the starch molecule into single glucose pieces, okay? But it takes time to do that. So if you feed a large meal, if you all just get out your finger enzymes, no one can see you, I can see you, so don't feel stupid. And if we say, for example, that we've fed our horse a large meal, what happens is feed starts moving really quickly through the small intestine. So if you imagine you're an enzyme and trying to cut up this feed as it goes flying down the small intestine, you don't really get much of a chance to get your scissors onto it and actually cutting it up. Whereas if we feed small meals and we give the stomach that capacity to hold on to feed and then just release it slowly into the small intestine and are not forcing it out into the small intestine, then the feed will move much more slowly. So if you pretend again now that you're going to cut this one up, you've got plenty of time to get in there and actually cut it up quite quickly. So the whole idea around the feeding small meals is just to let the feed move much more slowly through the small intestine so that the enzymes have actually got a chance to cut things up. If it doesn't get cut up, then it will either travel completely through the gastrointestinal tract undigested, which is what would happen to oil, for example, or with starch. And we're going to talk about this more later too. With starch, if that starch doesn't get it cut up in the small intestine, it ends up in the hindgut and causes issues with the balance of your hindgut bacteria, which we'll talk about at the moment in a lot more detail. So I'll come back and answer these questions towards the end. So keep asking questions. Just don't worry about me if I'm not answering them as I'm going along. I'm keeping an eye on them, but I'm trying not to get distracted as well. So your second tip in maximizing digestion is don't feed too much in total. And the thing that, so it's a similar issue in that if you feed too much in total, again, your horse has only got a certain volume between its mouth and its anus for food to actually fit. So if you're feeding a much larger volume than what fits comfortably in your horse's gut, what happens is it just has to move through much faster, because as fast as your horse is shoving food in the front end, it's literally almost coming out as manure at the back end. And I see this with horses that have got are fed a lot of hay, horses that have got access to free choice hay. This can happen too as well, because hay is so easy to eat and they don't have to go anywhere. They don't really have to work for it. And the issue with, actually, I did this last night. It's a really weird. Normally we would do events like this live, and then I would generally have people up with me doing different demonstrations and stuff. So I've had to come up with different ways of actually showing you these things. But if we imagine we've got a small meal here in my feed bin, and it's just obviously fluffy balls, but just pretend that, you know, we've got a nice varied diet here. It's lots of different colours. I've made a horse for you. I'm not particularly creative. I meant to ask my daughter to make this for me, but he's got a toilet roll, very expensive thing here that I've made, but that's its gastrointestinal tract. Obviously a cheap gastrointestinal tract without any twists and turns in it. Probably wouldn't get colic, this horse, or gastric ulcers, so he'd be quite a good one to own. But what I'm going to show you is with this small feed, if the horse is eating the feed, it can pretty much all fit in its gastrointestinal tract. And then what that means is the feed can sit in the gut. And I'm particularly talking about the hind gut here. So after we get past the small intestine, you're going to go into the hind gut, which is the cecum and then the colon. And in the cecum and the colon, the horses have got, an average size horse has got 115 trillion bacteria and a whole bunch of fungi. And essentially what the horse has done thousands of years ago is gone up and said to these little critters, hey, if I give you somewhere warm and safe to live and wet and no oxygen, would you give me what's left over from the fiber that I eat? Whatever you don't want, I'll have, and I'll use it as a source of energy. So these bacteria and fungi sit in your horse's gut, collectively called the microbiota, and they do the process of digesting fiber. So they will provide your horse with 80% or more of his daily calories each day. So they're incredibly important. But the thing is, their fermentation process is really slow. So they need the feed to actually sit around in the gut for a long period of time to give them a chance, because they're using enzymes too, and they're cutting things up as well. So you actually need to give them a chance to do that. If you feed your horse too much, and you have feed flying in through the gut, I'll keep shoving these balls in here, then, you know, the bacteria just aren't going to have enough time to do what they need to do. So we're getting at the point now where this horse is full and there's some feed coming out the other end. But, you know, that feed, because it wasn't too much, is going to sit there and give the bacteria and the fungi time to do their fermenting. Now, if I get a much larger feed, so feed bin's full on this one, still nice varied diet, but if I get a much larger feed and stick this in my toilet paper roll horse just as fast as in the same amount of time, so say over, imagining a 24-hour period, what starts to happen is the feed just comes out really, really quickly. So it's actually quite hard to shove these in, but you can see it all coming out now because there's just not enough room in the gut to fit all of this feed, and the poor bacteria, and they're going, hang on a minute, slow down, I'd only half eaten that bit of fiber, but it's gone, and the horse is not actually going to get access to that feed. So hopefully that helps you to see, fluffy balls everywhere now, hopefully that helps you to see what the effect of just feeding too much bulk is going to have. Now, about the cutoff point that we find is about 3% of their body weight. So if you're feeding a horse more than 3 kilograms per 100 kilograms of body weight per day, which is 15 kilograms for a 500 kilogram horse, that's also 3 pounds per 100 pound per day. So you work that out, is what, 3 times 33 pound of feed. So once you go over 33 pound of feed per day, that's about the point we find where the feed is going to start moving really quickly through the gastrointestinal tract. Now, because it's fiber, it doesn't necessarily have health consequences for the horse. So if you're feeding large meals of grain, and that grain is rushing through the small intestine and ends up in the hindgut, that definitely has negative health consequences, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. If you're feeding a lot of hay, or if your horse has got access to free choice hay and it's eating a lot of free choice hay, it's not necessarily going to do, well, it's not going to do any damage. So, you know, your horse is not going to get sick from doing this. It's just that, think about it, they're not digesting everything that they're eating, and so it's costing you a lot more to feed them. So it's really a cost consideration here. So someone asked last night, you know, what about free choice hay? And I mean, free choice hay is a wonderful thing, and if we can give our horses free choice hay and make sure that they have got, if they don't have pasture, make sure that they've got something in front of them all the time to be chewing, it's good for their mental health, it's good for their gastric health so their stomach, because they're salivating and they've got fibre in their stomach all the time, so the risk of gastric ulcers is lowered. It's good for the rest of their gut, because it's obviously keeping it nice and full of fibre and keeping things moving. It's not so good for your wallet. So if you have got horses that are absolutely flying through hay and you're going, how are these horses eating so much and yet still not putting on weight? It could be that this is what's at play. So you might want to look at doing like a slow feeder hay net, and just to try and slow them down. Or if that doesn't work, and they are tricky, if you've got horses that are shod for getting stuck in hay nets, you can look at doing something like the Savvy feeder. So I don't know if anyone's seen the Savvy feeders, but those neat little square feeders that would be very, very safe for horses with shoes on, that are the slow feeders, so that you can still have hay in front of your horses all the time. It's just that they can't take, massive great mouthfuls every time they go to get some. It actually slows them down and makes it a little bit more like grazing, because when you think about a horse grazing, they've actually got to work a little bit to eat enough fibre. And two, if the pasture is green, then there's a lot of water. So for every pound or kilogram of dry matter, they've actually got to eat many multiples more of actual pasture, because so much of the pasture they're eating is just water. So it's a very different situation, a horse that is grazing versus a horse that has got access to free choice hay. So this feeding too much in total generally comes back to when they're fed too much hay. Okay, so the third tip on how to maximize digestion, and this is the most important one of the three, is to keep the hindgut microbiota, so the bacteria and fungi that we've been talking about, healthy. So your horses have got this population, so this 115 trillion, imagine having to count all of those bacteria in their hindgut. And there's two main families of hindgut bacteria. There's the ones that love to ferment fibre, and they're your horse's friends. They're the ones that we would call the good bacteria. And then there's always also a population of bacteria that ferment starches and sugars, and they're always in the hindgut, and they're a part of the hindgut ecosystem. They're an important part of the ecosystem. The problem is when we feed them too much of their favourite food, so when we feed them too much starch and sugars, their population explodes. And when their population explodes, they start to shift, and in fact, I'll talk about this on the next slide, but they start to shift the environment away from what the fibre fermenting bacteria like. So your fibre fermenters love a neutral pH, so a pH of around 7 or slightly higher. That's their favourite sort of pH. Your starch and sugar fermenters thrive in a more acidic environment, and they also produce a lot of acid. So if you start to, say, feed in large meals and dump a lot of starch in the hindgut, then their population explodes, their acid production explodes, and they reduce the pH. And it only needs to go down to a pH of 6.2 before your fibre fermenting bacteria literally start to die. I'm jumping ahead of myself here, but I'll keep going because I'm there at the moment. So if you create that acidic environment, what you're doing effectively is killing off your horse's workforce for fermenting fibre, and then potentially you're losing up to 80% of your horse's daily calorie intake, because they don't have any way of digesting it. Your horse doesn't have the enzymes or the scissors necessary to cut up fibre. Only the hindgut bacteria have enough enzymes to cut up the fibre, or have the right enzymes to cut up the fibre. But if you accidentally kill those bacteria, and also the fungi that are wonderful fibre fermenters as well, your horse doesn't have any way of fermenting fibre. So even though you're feeding your horse hay, and I can't remember your name, sorry, but the person who mentioned racehorses before, this is what happens in a lot of racehorses, is they're fed a lot of raw grain, or a lot of raw maize, raw barley, and that raw grain ends up in their hindgut and starts to ferment and kills off all their fibre fermenting bacteria. So even though we feed these racehorses hay, they don't have any way of actually digesting the fibre. And so much of that calorie that is in that fibre, in that hay, is actually wasted, which is a big part of the reason why racehorses lose weight so quickly when they're in work, is because they actually have no way of fermenting their fibre. So it's so important from a horse's health and weight maintenance perspective to maintain these bacteria. And also from looking back at the cost perspective, if you kill your fibre fermenters, that means that your horse is now heavily reliant on your hard feed. And so the situation you typically get yourself into is your horse starts losing weight and you have to feed more hard feed, and they keep losing weight and you have to feed more hard feed, and they end up costing you an absolute fortune. Where if you just are so protective of that hindgut environment and are always thinking, how can I feed to make sure that I'm not affecting these hindgut bacteria, then your horse will have this really thriving population of fungi and bacteria that are going to do the work of taking all the calories for them out of their fiber, and you will find that they maintain weight so much easier on very, very little hard feed. They'll be able to utilise, certainly if you've got horses on pasture, utilise their pasture very well. Hay is a more expensive source of nutrient, but even more reason to make sure that they're extracting all of the calories that they possibly can out of those out of the hay that you're feeding them. So your 3 top tips for keeping your hindgut microbes healthy are: feed lots of forage, because fiber is the good microbes' favourite source of food. So if you want to keep their population really robust and healthy, then you need to feed them lots of fiber. And I'm going to add here too, the more fiber variety you can give them. So if you can give them, at least 2, if not 3 or 4 different types of grasses, and then add some alfalfa or lucerne, depending on where you are in the world, to that diet, so that they've also got that type of fiber. The more variety in fiber we can get, the more variety you're going to have within the microbial population. And the current thinking is that the more variety, the more robust that population in the horse's hindgut. And then also too, it's important, we're not going to talk about this so much today, but it's also important to remember that it's these good bacteria that produce your horse's B vitamins. They make biotin to keep their hooves healthy. They make hormones like dopamine, which are going to help regulate behavior. So you'll generally get a lot of flow-on effects, and really positive flow-on effects from feeding in a way that is going to keep the hindgut microbes really healthy. So the second tip is to be careful with grain. I've talked about this a fair bit already, but the thing with grain is they're high in starch, and I've shown you the starch, that's this long chain of glucose molecules. But the thing with starch, when it's inside a raw corn or a raw barley or a raw wheat, oats is the exception to this. So raw oats is okay to feed, but any of the other grains, the starch is actually bundled up so tightly in a little ball that when the enzymes come along to cut it up, they can't get to very much. And generally they can only cut about 30% of the glucose off the little starch bundles. Like, they're literally these tiny little bundles, and they've got protein packed all around them. They're very difficult to digest. So what you need to do is feed grain that has been processed. So when we cook grain, and this is what my PhD was about, was looking at ways that we could actually process grain so that we could feed it to horses without causing this damage in the hindgut. When you add heat and moisture and sometimes pressure, but certainly heat and moisture to a grain, what happens to the starch granule is it goes from being this really tightly bundled little ball to being a much more open structure. And you can see now, like, if you had a pair of scissors, that would be quite easy to cut up, and we can get upwards of 85-90% of the starch digested in the small intestine of the horse, which means that very, very little of that grain is going to be ending up in the hindgut. Only feeding grains when absolutely necessary, and feeding grains in small meals so that you don't get this effect of having things rushing through the small intestine, so that the enzymes don't have time to cut them up. And the last thing to keep in mind from the perspective of your hindgut microbes is just to minimize stressful events, and try not to pile stressful events on top of one another. So a stressful event from the perspective of the hindgut bacteria and fungi can be things like worming. So your enthelmintic ingredients will actually really knock around the bacterial population. Now, of course, worming is essential. We can't leave horses with worms just so that we protect their hindgut environment. But if you're still on a 6 or 8 weekly rotation of worming, really go back and rethink that. Talk to your vet about a better way of doing that. Use fecal egg counts to only worm when you need to. Use pasture rotation. There's a brilliant product out called BioWormer. So it's not a nutritional supplement, which is why I'm mentioning it, but I actually saw it when it was being developed, just in the early stages of the science of it back in the late 90s. And it's a fungi that you feed the spores to your horse daily, and when the fungi ends up in the manure, that it actually grows. And when the worms hatch and try to grow out of that manure pile, the fungi literally lassos them, and the worm can't get out and climb up on the grass and reinfect your horse. So if you have got heavy worm infestations and you're constantly having to worm, if you're in a wet, warm climate, for example, that's really going to be knocking around your hindgut bacteria. So do look into other ways you can use to control worms. Also, picking up manure is a great way to knock your worm population too. Other stressful events can be things like competition and travel, changing the diet. So if you're going to do any of those things, just make sure that you try and keep them to be one at a time so that you're not piling things back on one another. So I'll put the name of that product there for you. If you Google it, it's called BioWormer. It's relatively new. I'm not sure. I know that it was going to the US. I'm not sure if it's available there yet. Certainly available in Australia. I don't know about New Zealand, but Google it and just see if you can find it in the country that you're at. You are very welcome. All right. So third tip for reducing feeding costs is to meet all nutrient requirements. And this, for me, as a nerdy nutritionist, is probably the most fascinating one because you should see what some nutrient deficiencies can do to your horse. So weight loss, muscle loss, or low energy can be caused by nutrient deficiencies. And when you see those symptoms in your horse, our natural instinct is to respond to those situations by feeding more. So you might see your horse losing weight and go, oh, it's not getting enough feed. I'll just feed it more of whatever it's being fed, or, losing muscle or feeling kind of flat and tired. But what you may not realize is there could be a nutrient deficiency that is actually causing that issue. And the real solution then is to fix the deficiency and not just to feed more. So Clissa, no, it's not. I don't know if we've even got it because it's not a nutritional supplement at all, the BioWormer. Like, it's literally a wormer, but it's a natural wormer. It's just that you put it in their feed to eat it. So I don't know if it is in FeedXL. Just to answer that question really quickly. So common nutrient deficiencies that will cause either weight loss, muscle loss, or low energy. Zinc is on the top of this list for me because zinc deficiency is really, really common. Our forages and hays, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world, but forages and hays generally contain around half of the zinc that a horse actually needs. Sometimes it contains as low as a quarter of the zinc that your horse actually needs. So if you're not conscious of that and you're not actually either using a commercial feed that's got zinc in it at the right levels or using a supplement that has got zinc at the right levels, then your horse could well be zinc deficient. And the thing with zinc is it will reduce your horse's ability to both digest and absorb nutrients. So this is where it gets really interesting, is if an animal is zinc deficient, and this hasn't been shown specifically in horses, but it has been shown in other monogastric animals, so pigs and humans, zinc deficient animals can't actually produce the enzymes in their pancreas to digest food. So the food is potentially going through the small intestine and there's just simply not enough enzymes to get in there and do the cutting up work that needs to be done for the nutrients to absorb. So that's a bit of a bummer for your horse because it can't cut things out. And then zinc deficiency will also reduce the oh God, the words go from my head. I was talking about them last night. Little fingers on the, can someone tell me what they are? I'm sure someone watching will know. The absorptive surface on the small intestine. So the small intestine is not the villi. Thank you, Ara. The small intestine is not a flat surface. It's actually got all these little villi on there, and they're like fingers. And then on the villi, there's all these tiny little microvilli. So if you actually spread the surface of the small intestine out, the surface area is huge to allow for all of these nutrients to be absorbed. If your horse is zinc deficient, there's every chance that it's lost a lot of those villi and also the microvilli, so that the absorptive surface, even if they can manage to cut up the nutrients, they can't actually absorb them. And so then, again, they lose those nutrients. And this is all costing you money because you're feeding stuff that your horse isn't actually using. Sodium deficiencies. So sodium is a part of just ordinary salt. So if your horse gets sodium deficient, they're going to have reduced sweating. They will end up dehydrated because their thirst response is not being triggered properly. They'll get muscle fatigue, and they'll also have slow recovery from exercise because they can't replenish their glycogen stores in their muscles if they're not rehydrated properly. So any endurance and competitive trail riders that are here with us will know exactly what I'm talking about because this is such a big part of being successful in those sports. But you really need to make sure that your horse's sodium requirement is met. Again, it's a very common deficiency. Our pasture on this place is a weird anomaly. It has 0 sodium in it. So my horses would become extremely sodium deficient if I wasn't aware of that. So this is why we say often we'll add salt to feeds. And this is also why we say make sure your horse has got access to free choice salt all the time because they actually have an appetite for it and they will go and eat it. Vitamin E can be very quickly become deficient when your horse has not got access to any green pasture. So green pasture is the bee's knees in terms of vitamin E supply in your horse's diet. if you've got a horse that's on hay that's been stored for more than 6 months, it's going to have virtually no vitamin E content left. And also dried out pasture has got virtually no vitamin E. And the thing with vitamin E deficiency is it will cause muscle wasting. So you might be looking at this horse and going, why is it losing its muscle? And trying to feed it, you know, protein supplements and more energy and doing all these other things. But if you haven't actually identified that it's a vitamin E deficiency that is causing that muscle wasting, then nothing else you do is going to help your horse. It's just going to cost you a fortune that you could have fixed reasonably cheaply by putting a vitamin E supplement in there. Lysine is a component of protein. So protein is made up of all these different amino acids, and lysine is just one of them. It's the one generally your horse will run out of the fastest. And if they do run out of lysine, the muscle building process actually has to stop. And where you'll see, like visually see the lysine deficiencies showing up the most is in lactating mares. So if anyone's ever bred a mare and you've noticed that their top line has dropped off and muscle over her rump and in her shoulders has dropped off, then what she's using is literally taking the protein from her own muscles and using it to make milk protein for her foal. So when they start doing that, it's telling you that there's almost certainly a lysine deficiency there, and probably a bunch of other amino acids that are a bit low in her diet as well. And then the last one I just want to single out is vitamin B1. So if your horse is vitamin B1 deficient, it can't get its muscle engines running properly without vitamin B1. So your horse will just feel fatigued and tired and feel flat. And again, it might lead you to going, oh, I need to feed this horse more and feeding it more energy. But if you're not actually fixing that issue of vitamin B1 deficiency, just feeding your horse more is probably not going to help. So it's always important when you see any of those symptoms, weight loss, muscle loss, or low energy, it's not just a matter of feeding them more. Generally, it's you know, you do need to make sure that the diet's balanced. I just want to show you, for anyone who hasn't seen a FeedXL diet analysis before, this is what you would see if you went to the graph in the diet results. And the way we read it is this line down the middle here, the blue line, is when 100% of your horse's requirements for that nutrient are met. So you can see crude protein there, it's sitting on 102%. So requirements for crude protein in this diet are met, and also digestible energy. I mean, 96% of digestible energy requirement is going to be enough energy for most horses. So Kitty is saying, how do you test horses' levels of these key nutrients? And that is a really good question, Kitty. So one part of the process is actually doing a diet analysis, which is what I'm showing you here at the moment. So this diet is just oat and hay at 4 kilograms per day or 8.8 pounds per day. Oats at 2.5 kilograms per day, so it's going to be around 6 pounds. And then your poor quality grass pasture at free access, so 16 to 24 hours. And you can see it is meeting energy and protein, but look at all the other deficiencies that are in the diet. So if you've got your horse on a hay and then a kind of, you know, a diet where you've bought in ingredients and made it up yourself but haven't added any vitamins and minerals, this is kind of what your diet's going to look like. There will be a lot of deficiencies in there. It may not be as pronounced as this. You may have some complete feed in there that may or may not meet all requirements, but this, Kitty, is where it comes back to put in your horse's diet in FeedXL, and if you don't use FeedXL, grab that free basic plan and run your horse's diet through it, and it'll give you an idea of how your horse's diet is looking. The other part is you can blood test for some of these things. So vitamin E, for example, really the only way to accurately diagnose a vitamin E deficiency is to do a blood vitamin E level, which you can talk to your vet about, but there's not a lot of nutrients. So selenium and vitamin E are two exceptions to blood testing for nutrient deficiency. Most of your other minerals, blood results really don't tell you much, if anything at all. So say, for example, horses can become severely calcium deficient to the point where they will just snap ribs or snap a leg or break their pelvis when they roll. They can be like that calcium deficient. But if you did a blood calcium, it would look perfectly normal. So it doesn't actually tell you anything to look at a lot of the nutrients in the blood. So I've just got the nutrients that we just talked about: lysine, zinc, vitamin E, and vitamin B1 there, and sodium as well. But sodium in this diet was actually met. Just to give you an idea of that's what a full analysis on FeedXL will show you, and it can help to identify those deficiencies. And then, of course, it will help you to actually fill those deficiencies so that they're not a part of your horse's diet anymore. And it is quite amazing. I know I've been doing this for a long time, and it does still amazes me how much difference it can make just to get a horse's diet balanced in how easily they will maintain their weight. For anyone with an easy keeper, it can also weirdly make a difference to how quickly they will lose weight. So if you have, say, an iodine deficient horse that's got a poorly functioning thyroid hormone, getting that iodine level corrected in your horse's diet can help them then to have a metabolism that's running at the right speed, and get them to actually get some weight off. So it goes both ways. And for people that have got laminitic horses and PSSM horses, FeedXL will also identify when an ingredient is low enough in starch and sugars for you, or too high an ingredient should be avoided. So it'll help you sift through, because there's so many. I mean, there's hundreds. I think in our US database, there's 400 joint supplements in the database. So, I mean, there's thousands and thousands of supplement options there. Deborah saying, is high iron a problem? The grass hay available in our area is really high in iron, like that sample shown in the slide, or more so. It's a big subject, Deborah. And what I might do is that's a really good question to ask over on our FeedXL nutrition forum as well. We do chat about that a fair bit over there. The evidence is sketchy on it, and I think it probably gets a little bit too much focus in people balancing diets. But ask the question and I'll give you a much more detailed answer on our forum. So the fourth tip for reducing costs is don't over supplement. So we all want to make sure our horses have everything they need, but this often results in expensive over-supplementation. And a lot of that expensive over-supplementation simply comes from the fact that if you're not using some sort of diet analysis, you're kind of left guessing in your head as to whether your horse is actually getting all the nutrients it needs. So you might go through a scenario like, your horse is on good quality pasture over the spring, and is holding weight fine on pasture. It's in a decent amount of work, but then as your pasture quality starts to drop off into a hotter summer, your horse starts to lose weight. So you go to a feed store and find an extruded grain-based complete feed, so lovely and digestible, to put more calories into your horse's diet. And then you might be reading in a magazine reading about, the importance, like we just discussed, of all these vitamins, minerals, and you've got that bit of concern that maybe you aren't fully meeting your horse's vitamin and mineral requirements, so you also go and buy a vitamin and mineral supplement and add that to your horse's diet. And then you might go to a nutrition seminar that's talking about performance horses, and they're talking about the importance of electrolytes. So you also grab an electrolyte supplement, put that in your diet. And then your friend or your neighbour might tell you how much better their horse has been since they've been on a magnesium and vitamin E supplement, and you don't want your horse to miss out on that either. So you add that in, and it can just keep going like this. I'd love to see how many people are nodding their heads at the moment, but because you have that nagging doubt in the back of your head that your horse is getting everything it needs. Kitty's saying, sounds so familiar. Then you can get in this situation where you're adding all of these supplements, and the thing is, most of them aren't necessary. So if you look again, this is the same graph that we were looking at before. There's obviously no deficiencies in this one because we've added so much stuff in. So this horse has well and truly got its nutrient requirements met, but look at it, it's sitting, copper, zinc, selenium, manganese, they're all sitting up close to or over 200% of your horse's requirements. So you're actually feeding your horse twice as much as what your horse needs, versus if you use FeedXL, then you know what your horse is getting, and you know what you need to add and what you don't need to add. So I've used the same horse, the same diet. So we've still got the poor quality grass pasture in here. We've still got the oat and hay at 4 kilograms. I've added now a kilogram of lucerne hay or alfalfa hay for you guys in North America in there for the protein, for the very varied nutrients, because variety in the diet is really important to cover all nutrient requirements as well, and also to give that fibre variety that we were talking about for the hindgut microbes. I've reduced the extruded feed down to 2 kilograms because that was all I needed to add to meet energy requirements, and I've just kept 3 grams instead of the 10 or 15 grams I had before per day of the magnesium and vitamin E supplement. And if you have a look at the diet now, It's still meeting all of the horse's requirements, but instead of costing you $2,768 per year, it's now costing $2,052. So you've just saved $716 on that one horse just by taking out those couple of supplements that you didn't need. So Deborah's just asked, what about toxin binder supplements? So yes, there is supplements that that you would or could add. So if you had a mycotoxin issue, say with a ryegrass pasture or with damp pastures in warm climates that can have mycotoxin issues, or if you're concerned about mycotoxins in hay, there's mycotoxins come from everywhere. But yes, you would certainly add a mycotoxin binder on top of that. But you still want to make sure that the base diet that are providing these basic nutrients is not being overdone. So you're not, using a complete feed or a fortified feed with a supplement, with more supplements, and just adding all these nutrients on there. Roxanne saying you haven't got the graph up. Hopefully it's there. I can see it. Hopefully other people can see it, and my internet hasn't gone kaput on you. But yeah, Kitty's saying I can see it. That's good. Hopefully most of you can see it. So we're almost done. And the last final tip for reducing feeding costs is to keep horses warm. I was laughing last night because I don't think any of us need a good excuse to go and buy another horse rug. I don't know what it is about horse rugs, but I love buying them, new ones. But it's true in winter, because horses are warm-blooded, they've essentially got to leave their engine running all the time to create body heat, and that burns a lot of calories. So for all of us, me included, that have got easy keepers, winter is actually our friend, and having this increased burn of calories over winter is a really, really good thing, because it means that easy keepers will often lose weight over winter as long as you're not rugging them and keeping them warm. So you guys are excluded from this tip. Don't keep your horses warm. If anything, let your horses get cold over, not uncomfortably cold and shivering, give them shelter, but just let them experience the cold climate so that they can lose weight over winter. But anyone with a hard keeper, so anyone who's already piling a whole heap of feed into their horse, and of course you're heading into winter soon in North America, if you've got a horse that does take quite a bit of feed to keep weight on, keeping your horse warm is going to really help. So blanketing them or rugging them, whatever the terminology is you use, definitely helps. Like just having clothes on for your horse and traps the heat in close to their body, and also making sure too they've got plenty of hay and high fiber ingredients, because when those bacteria and fungi do their work of fermenting, they actually produce a lot of heat, and they're like your horse's internal little heater, so it keeps them warm as well. But I have heard it say, old timers have said, that a rug in winter is worth an extra feed a day, and they're probably pretty right. Keeping your horse warm over winter probably is about the equivalent calories of actually giving them an extra feed. But the benefit here is that once you buy a rug, you've bought it, you don't have to keep buying it again until your horse trashes it, as they're so prone to do. But it's going to be cheaper than piling more and more kilograms or pounds of feed into your horse to keep the weight on. So it's an easy one, and also a very, very effective one for keeping weight on there. So that's the end of all of the tips. We're just over an hour. Completely understand if anyone's got to go. Thank you very much for being here and joining us. I will just scroll back up through some of these questions and answer them. If anyone hasn't answered the poll questions, I'd really appreciate before you leave to just jump on there and answer those for me, because it's just interesting information for us to have to understand, who we've got here and what kind of information is useful to you. Yeah, and so I'll go now back up to the top, and I'll just work through some of these. Gosh, there's a lot of questions, you guys. I'll work through some of these questions. Excuse me while I stare at my screen and try to find questions. Clissa saying 1,000 wallabies keep my pasture too short for my 25-year-old horses to graze properly nowadays. Yeah, it's it probably sounds funny to you guys in the US and Canada, but wallabies and kangaroos are an issue on nice pasture. They do